Record to the cloud. All right, Tim, good to be back with you for part two I guess, this will be more evolutionary thinking in one form or another, but we've been interacting on Twitter with some other really bright folks over the last few months and talking about Whitehead, talking about the extent of purpose, the extent of sentience and consciousness in nature, but certainly we share this desire to understand the relevance of evolution across not only biology, but into physics and cosmology, and also in the philosophical domain, understanding the role evolutionary theory plays in our epistemology and how we understand what knowing means, given that we are evolved creatures trying to adapt to environments. What is knowledge in the context of what Darwin called the struggle for existence? And so, last time we talked about science and the role that science plays in society, and the role that science communicators, such as yourself, the important role that and the difficult job you have in our current complicated world, where science is obviously so important and yet so fraught because of, ultimately, I'm curious what you think about this, but it's difficult to separate science as a human activity out from culture and politics and even religious belief and worldview, all these things. Science exists inside of all of that complexity and nonetheless produces knowledge that's effective, and so how do we communicate about it and apply it and navigate a social reality together that's messy and full of a lot of unscientific ideas and beliefs. So, I guess, why don't we start talking about why the evolutionary perspective is relevant socially, and why it's relevant to navigating our human level of existence, and then from there maybe we can broaden out into more cosmological questions. What do you think about that plan?
No, that sounds like as good a place to start as any, for sure. And already there's so much in what you've said. Why is the evolutionary perspective important for us? Well, in the trivial sense that you've already said, that we are, most of us believe now, I think, that we are evolved beings, and we might have different models of what that actually means. That we may think that the Darwinian model is too reductive or too restrictive or whatever, and it's something we talked about last time and probably we'll get onto again this time. So we may have some other kind of evolutionary model, and I think another of these subject areas that we are moving through is the generality of evolutionary thinking, and how in a very basic sense any creation myth is an evolutionary, story, basically. How did we get to a state like the one we find ourselves in from some kind of prior condition? What are the processes that lead to that? So that evolutionary thinking, in a very, trivial way, is just deeply embedded into the way we think about everything, with all these different frameworks, any kind of explanatory framework, basically. And of course, we've always wanted to understand ourselves, maybe almost first and foremost. And there's a lot of criticism that we might have, in a post-Darwinian world, for certain kinds of anthropocentrism. Oh, well, we're just an animal like any other, so why should we be so fixated on ourselves? But there's some truth to that, but we also have to give ourselves a little bit of a pass, because we are the animal asking the question. So it's hardly surprising that, for ourselves, we are in some sense, despite Copernicus, despite Darwin, etc., still at the center of the universe. Um, so, what does understanding ourselves in this way offer us? I think we want to avoid the kind of maybe more naive evolutionary view of something like, obviously genetic determinism or certain strands of evolutionary psychology. But at the same time, we don't necessarily want to completely discount that there might be something there. It might be that it might be, or it seems, clearly the case that certain patterns of behavior that we have that were adapted to previous social, cultural, environmental circumstances are still, still have inertia in the present time, and that might be, for better or perhaps worse. There might be strategies or traits that worked in our evolutionary past that are not so, apt in the situation that we find ourselves in today. And I think the contention of the evolutionary thinker is that understanding why we are the way we are will help us to kind of, I like to say, to turn evolution into intelligent design in some sense. We can, by understanding ourselves, and there are words I'll use here which needs to be clear are just metaphors, but by reverse engineering ourselves, although we are not just machines or whatever that might imply, that enables us to understand the moving parts in such a way that we can then intervene on those evolutionary trajectories and try to kind of, steer things in a slightly better direction. But even there, I've already got to say, we don't want to be too associated with the way evolutionary thinking kind of went in the 19th century and why it ended up getting a really bad name. There's a real shadow side to this kind of view, the human progress sort of view, and the idea that, a certain small cabal of people might be the ones who understand humans well enough that they understand the conditions of our evolution so well that they can then, manipulate and engineer them en masse, and that'll get us on the right track. So it's very fraught territory. So even that really simple question, what does the evolutionary perspective offer us? And of course, I think it offers us a great deal, but we've got to tread lightly and be careful and not ignore the fact that people have thought, certainly since the 19th century, I mean, certainly longer than that, but it was a very big thing in the 19th century. And so I think, as we talked last time, Darwin himself tried to avoid association with the idea of evolution because it was so associated in the cultural sphere with human progress. Hence, he didn't use the term in the first edition of On the Origin of Species. So, yeah, we're navigating a fraught landscape as soon as we enter into any of this.
Yeah, I mean, the social Darwinism is alive and well, and it's definitely when we talk about the relevance of evolutionary thinking for human society and culture, in the popular imagination, I mean, most people are immediately going to go to eugenics,
Yeah.
And so there's a need to acknowledge the fact that we are evolved creatures, and that, as you say, while evolution didn't find its origin in any kind of intelligent design could itself evolve. And we hope, I think, that it would. And
well, it has. It has.
Intelligence has evolved, right? And we have some capacity to design. But then the question is, as evolved animals, as organisms, do we have access to anything like what Plato called the good? Is there some internal compass that points us toward better, such that there would be some objective measure of progress? That's certainly not an easy question to answer, because while on the one hand, some perfectly moral, compassionate people would say, well, of course there's a good and it's objective and we can orient ourselves to it. Historically, different, power players in the past have asserted their sense of the good and used it as a justification to exterminate those who disagreed or who, for whatever reason, didn't live up to that standard. And so, you know, one cannot simply just reject this more relativistic understanding of goods in an evolutionary context, because there are different there are differences, there are variations, there's a whole ecosystem of organisms, each of whom strives for its own sense of the good, perhaps, But then again, the human, while we are an evolved animal, seems unique in the sense that, in the very sense that we can ask questions about the universe. You know,
Mm.
we're not stepping outside of the universe. There's no view from nowhere, but yet, even though we're like unique species evolved with this set of sensory organs and these cognitive capacities which are more or less contingent. I mean, I wouldn't go as far as people like I'm blanking on his name, the cognitive scientist, who's kind of an idealist, who thinks that space and time are kind of illusions.
Oh, Hoffman, Donald Hoffman.
Donald Hoffman, yeah, of
Mm.
course. I wouldn't go quite that far, but there's some sense in which, and
Mm.
Nietzsche riffed on this, that like we're not evolved to perceive the truth or to know the truth. We're evolved to survive, and in the human form of animal, our concept of truth is just an elaborate. It's like a mating ritual, or it has an evolutionary function for survival, but not
Mm.
necessarily access. It's not giving us access to some mind independent form of the true.
It's funny because you started with this, we talked about science and it being nested in culture, and then you sort of said, oh well, before we get to the cosmological, let's talk about evolution and what it can offer us as humans. But then we immediately got to the cosmological with the idea of the form of the good and all of that sort of thing. And really what we're talking about is the difference between global telos
Mm-hmm.
and local telos. And this is a really big um, and contentious issue for evolutionary schemes. So a lot of the cosmological evolutionary schemes end up affirming a kind of global, direction, global aim, telos to the whole shebang. And some might say that's the reason why we shouldn't extend evolutionary reasoning to the cosmological, because it automatically, comes with that sort of idea. And I think, that would be part of Nietzsche's criticism that you referenced, even though I think that Nietzsche is a thoroughly evolutionary thinker. And this is another conversation I'm currently having on Twitter.
Yeah, that's right.
Uh, I mean, there's a lot to say there, but I mean, the whole genealogical historicist analysis of why we think, the deconstruction of why we think the things we do and why we're concerned with the big issues that we're concerned with, and his attempt to show the emptiness of them. Really, he's doing an evolutionary reverse engineering of our, beliefs and values.
Yeah.
And again, that's
Genealogy. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Like that's exactly the kind of thing that evolutionary, reasoning can be applied to. And I like to use Daniel Dennett's term, or I think Dennett attributes it to someone else, I can't remember who, but universal acid. It's like once you start thinking in this evolutionary manner, and then
Yeah.
you're deconstructing, which is, kind of a buzzword, and we might not want to use it, or reverse engineering any given phenomenon. We see that it becomes really, really pervasive. But we've gone, I think, already to this cosmological issue of firstness, which is kind of something that you and I have been going back and forth on a lot. It's like, what is the minimal set of functions, let's say, that we need to get a world that looks the way it does now out of a cosmological evolutionary
Right.
process? And then one of the big questions is, do we have a global direction? Does this whole thing going somewhere? Or are we looking at the sum of all of these little local moves, like
Mhm.
in the social context, piecemeal social engineering as opposed to some sort of, global program for reform. And in the organismal context, in the very specific circumstances that the organism finds itself right now, is this move or that move a better move, rather than does this move take me closer to the global optimum. It's
Mm-hmm.
a lot of local optimum tracking, and what a lot of people would say is one of Darwin's original, one of the original aspects of Darwin's thought. Again, bearing in mind that he's a 19th century evolutionary thinker, emerging from a lineage of evolutionary thinkers. So it's like, in what ways is he original? And he certainly is original. But one of the things people say is that he tries to remove the global telos. He tries to remove the capital P progress from his model and just talk about how there's a kind of emergent, you know, progress or directionality. Let's not use the term progress if we can avoid it. That
Yeah.
that emerges from all of this like piecemeal or very local problem solving. And whether Darwin actually thought that is really questionable. Like he can be he equivocates on a lot of these big questions and maybe thought different things at different times. So that's in itself a difficult
As we
question.
all do.
Yeah, exactly. So that's in it, especially with these kind of really fundamental issues. Darwin is not a metaphysician per se, but he really is dealing with these deep, metaphysical themes, and he seems to shift back and forth on them. As you say, that's totally reasonable.
Yeah.
Uh,
So, you asked the question earlier, whether evolution being limited to just Darwin's conception
mm,
of it and the mechanism of natural selection, whether that's too reductionistic and that, Darwin himself was inheriting a whole lineage of evolutionary thought. There's such a diverse array of ways of, applying the evolutionary intuition. And so I think we're already pivoting away from the focus on human society, but one of the issues with social Darwinism is this notion of, evolution being ultimately about a struggle for existence among individuals competing for scarce resources in a fixed
mm,
environment.
mm,
And as a model, it's powerful. But the reality is that environments are not fixed and that organisms seem to be predominantly in the business, perhaps all the way back to the origin of life, in constructing their own environments. And so rather than thinking of the organism as having to fit into a pre-existing niche, niche construction perhaps goes all the way down to the origin of life. I mean, this is part of the hot spring hypothesis that
mm,
Dave Deemer and Bruce Damer have been developing, that life begins, like if you want to understand the origin of life, you have to think environmentally, rather than looking for the heroic individual cell that pulled off the feet of whatever we're going to say life, however we're going to define life. You look for a community of protocells that can emerge spontaneously, that just, bilipid membranes with a bunch of polymers inside that are, organic chemistry raining down from the sky. And you get a wet dry cycle at a hot spring, and that can create chemical selection. And then eventually, out of this community of activity in this environment, this niche, the
mm,
first individual living cells emerge gradually. And so, the point is the Darwinian mechanism is too simple, and it emphasizes individuals and fixed environments, and it makes the evolutionary process from the organism's point of view seem as though the organism were passive, as though the organism's not actively constructing the conditions determining its evolution,
mm,
right? And so if you expand, I know I'm eager to hear you get in on this, but if we expand the conception of evolution beyond, and maybe this isn't really Darwin's view, maybe this is a more neo-Darwinian view, beyond the sense of an individual competing for scarce resources in a fixed environment, into this sense of, if you're going to use competition, I'll use cooperation, even though we're being anthropomorphic here. You could just as easily say life is about finding relationships which are mutually enhancing, creating environments which are mutually enhancing and which enrich the possibility space for new forms of life to emerge and flourish. And so if you apply that kind of evolutionary metaphor to human society, it brings us in a whole different direction. Rather than justifying neoliberal capitalism, you know, and of course the Soviets were already hip to this, and that view of society as an organism erasing the individual can also be extremely problematic and violent and dangerous. So we need a happy medium here. But I guess in the English speaking world, in the West, you predominantly get this myth of coming out of social Darwinism, of the individual competing, rather than a sense of the community of life, creating the conditions for further, evolution. So, yeah, how does that land for you?
Well, again, there's just so much there to respond to. I mean, you partly hit on the way that the reception of different perspectives in evolutionary reasoning, as I like to call it, has been very political. And so the backlash against the neo-Lamarckian thing in the early 20th century, and then Lyshenkoism in the Soviet era, whereas neo-Darwinianism getting championed in the West and all of that. There's a very complex political issue, political context surrounding the way we have used these theories. There's the implication that some make that a kind of evolutionary or social Darwinism also leads to fascism and led to the Nazis and all of this kind of thing. And so it's very difficult to disentangle the kind of basement level science and reasoning, the logic of these positions, from the way they've become integrated into different political systems and views, the way they've been sort of cherry-picked maybe, or particular things have been emphasized to the exclusion of other aspects for particular, social, political reasons. So that just complicates a lot of this stuff. It complicates what we mean by, as you sort of suggested, Darwinism. Do we mean by Darwinism what Darwin had to say, or do we mean, the neo-Darwinian modern synthesis? That tends to be what we mean in terms of common parlance when people say Darwinian or Darwinism, and almost especially when people who are trying to push back against, what they see as the hegemony of that kind of view in biology, when they say Darwinism, and they may say neo-Darwinian, but they might as well say neo-Mendelian, given the massive role of population genetics in that view. And Darwin, didn't have, genes were not part of his framework. He didn't really have a mechanism of heritability, which could also be one of the things we criticize Darwin for. So there's a lot of stuff going on here, and Darwin himself does talk about the role of the organism. So we talk now about there's this movement in evolutionary biology to bring the organism back in, and that's framed as a pushback against orthodox Darwinism. But it's not really a pushback against Darwin. In some sense, it's like a return to Darwin. And he even talked about, behavior being able to lead the way. So habits then becoming, concretized or stabilized in lineages, and that being, one of the mechanisms that drove the evolution of lineages. And so there's this issue with the way we frame things. So is it competition first, or is it cooperation first? Is it the individual first? Is it the collective first? Well, again, immediately that sounds really political, the second part of that at least. That's the right wing, left wing sort of divide to some extent. And, evolutionary views have been equally mobilized by people, groups across the political spectrum, as we've discussed. So I think, no one of these perspectives is complete. These are just corollaries. Two sides of the same coin: cooperation and competition. It would be absurd, and some people try as a pushback against, again, what they see as orthodox Darwinism, to try and say, oh no, it's all about cooperation. Competition is a minor player, or we shouldn't think about that at all. It's not nature red in tooth and claw. It's everything, getting along and learning to live together. And it's like, well, that doesn't match my experience
It doesn't explain venom,
it
right?
doesn't explain venom. It doesn't explain, like big cats and all kinds of things.
Yeah.
But neither does the competition first view, or the exclusivity of competition, really explain all of the, like ecology in some broader sense, or obviously mutualistic symbiosis very specifically. So organisms are always, cooperating and competing at the same time.
At different scales too. Yeah.
At different scales, exactly. So it becomes this very complex, nested, multi-scale phenomenon, evolution, and just the complexity just seems to ramify over the course of the evolution of the universe.
Yeah.
So all of these things are partly true, and one needs a perspective which can account for their relative influence, I think. And that's, of course, a tremendously difficult thing to do. And I don't think it will ever be, reducible to a specific formalism. Like, I think the formalisms, and maybe we'll talk about some of this stuff, but that might be, appropriate to evolutionary reasoning in general, are going to be trivial. It's like, to make it really trivial, it's like, dynamic variation plus selection equals evolution. And it's like, okay, cool, that's really pervasive, doesn't explain anything. It just describes a kind of very basic logic of evolutionary change. Then you've got to plug the details of any given study system at whatever level of analysis you're actually engaging with it at, and recognizing that you might be able to engage with a lot of these, complex hierarchical systems at lots of different levels of analysis. So you plug in the details into your very basic, let's say Bayesian mechanics, or the Ferenczi principle or something. You've got a very basic formalism. In itself, it doesn't explain anything. It's just like systems tend to evolve, or tend to appear as though they are adapted to their environment, or embodying a generative model of their environment, or whatever. You can use different language to say essentially the same thing, but you need to plug in a lot of details to turn that basic formalism into a empirically useful model, or much less an explanatory model. And so that kind of underwrites another one of these points that we've not really touched on yet in this chat, but we talked about before. There won't be, I guess it links to the kind of the neo-Darwinian thing, and genetic determinism, and reductionism in general in evolutionary reasoning. And what I think we can reduce things to, again, is kind of simple formal models of processes, but they're not going to be explanatory in and of themselves. So maybe, Kant was in some sense exactly right when he said there'll never be a Newton of the blade of grass, because the kind of predictive formalisms, dynamical laws and boundary conditions that Newton was using have been so successful in classical mechanics. They apply to incredibly simple systems. They are evolutionary. I mean, obviously, dynamical laws are evolutionary, but they only are explanatory of the behavior of extremely simple systems. And we can't expect that kind of grand unified theory that can be written on a t-shirt or whatever when we're talking about, more complex evolving systems.
Right. But okay, so this might be a good place to pivot into the cosmological properly at this point, to talk about Kant. He wasn't just saying that organisms are more complicated than planets or mass in motion. He was saying that organisms are of a different kind, and the same categories which can exhaustively explain the physical, mechanical world are impotent in the face of this new form of causality, which is circular or self-organizing.
Yeah.
And Kant wasn't willing to grant scientific knowledge of self-organization. He thought we could only sort of use analogy and metaphor and, yeah, apply the mechanistic models as much as you can to the biological world, but ultimately you're going to fail to capture what is essential to that domain, which is purposiveness, which is, in some sense, every organism produces itself, and each part in that organism is produced by the other parts for the sake of, there's the purpose, the whole, right?
Mm.
And so all of a sudden you have like what we would nowadays call top down causation, downward causation, and again, nowadays we talk about the emergence of a higher level system that, in order to understand the behavior of the parts, you have to make reference to that higher level. And at that point, when you start to factor in the role of wholes in the natural world, you can no longer treat that world as, I guess, directly available to abstract thought. I think in some way it's an admission. We're forced to admit that our models will always be a step behind that which we are attempting to model. And Kant started to grasp this in the Critique of Judgment, but especially in the it was published as Opus Posthumum, the notes of this other book he was working on when he died, where he grasped the sense in which our own knowledge is a function of our organismic embodiment, right? And so he started to root this whole transcendental apparatus that he developed in the first critique in the living body. And in so many ways is like he was prefiguring Merleau-Ponty and embodied
Mm.
phenomenology later. But the idea was that, like, as von Uexküll would describe it, also applying the Kantian perspective to biology, there's a kind of Umwelt, and each organism has its own spatio-temporal intuition that is dependent upon its adaptation, in its environment, and the way that it has found a world, or constructed a world relevant to itself. And I see Friston's free energy principle and the Bayesian mechanics and physics of sentience, as his phrase now too, as a further extension of this, but really trying to formalize it,
Mm.
in mathematical terms. And so we've reached a place in science now, and it's astounding to me to read thinkers like Friston and Michael Levin and others who are establishing in a rigorous way a view that, for me as a graduate student, I thought was going to be kind of marginal at best for my whole life. And now all of a sudden it's like, oh no, this is how we can most scientifically think about self-organizing systems, right? But the first question, what is the relevance of evolutionary thinking in human society? My simple answer to that would be, among many other things, it shows us that human beings are continuous with the rest of the natural world. We came out of this world. Our consciousness is in some way a function of nature. Nature is capable of us, right? And so when you turn the evolutionary lens on yourself and back on the universe to try to understand where it all came from and where we came from, I think we're justified in, not just granting self-organization as being operative at all scales in nature. So we're already, pushing beyond Kant in that sense, but also granting interiority, or there's a word Whitehead uses in his lectures that he doesn't publish, perceptivity, granting perceptivity to the physical world, where Whitehead he uses Kant to talk about what this non-conscious form of perceptivity, or percipience is another term he uses. he says it's like what Kant means by an intuition without a concept. So
Mm-hmm.
Kant says intuitions without concepts are blind. And Whitehead says blind perceptivity, in the sense that Kant meant an intuition without a concept, is pervasive in nature. It's how causal transmission operates in the physical world, is through these acts of blind percipience, or intuition without a concept. And then later, as evolutionary novelty and complexity accumulates, you eventually get animals with sense organs and nervous systems capable of adding this other phase to the process of percipience, which is reflection upon that percipience. And that's what a concept would be for Whitehead. And but it's an elaboration upon this more primary process, which he later comes to call, in his published writing, prehension.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so while we might grant, I think there's two separate issues here, and I think you and I fully agree that self-organization goes all the way down. The question is, does what we experience as consciousness, in any way, in some protoform, go all the way down as well?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I love how all across the landscape these basic ideas take us. I mean, because you've just covered so much to end up at consciousness.
Yeah.
One of the things, going back to Kant, is recognizing that purposiveness, or that final causation, and the mereological aspect, part-whole relations, and all of that kind of stuff. I mean, that's of course incredibly prescient in a way. I mean, even though at the same time it's also very much not new at his time. So it's a new way of putting it, and he kind of sets the principles of a kind of modern organicism are put together and defined there by him. And some of this, people will sometimes say that, Kant said there would never be a Newton of the blade of grass, and then look, Darwin comes along, and he is that. And one of the important factors there is there's this debate about whether Darwin, we may have touched on this last time, we probably did, but whether he is removing purpose from the natural world and it's all just now blind mechanism, and that in some sense seems to be very simpatico with the kind of Laplacianization of Newton, which is the metaphysical interpretation of Newton's laws in some sense by Pierre-Simon Laplace. And people can fit the Darwinian basic intuition into that model, or there's a whole bunch of other people, and I think very much Darwin himself, who think of it as naturalizing purpose. This is a way that purposes or final causes or whatever can be understood without the recourse to some outside agent that is projecting or imposing those goals onto these systems. Goals can emerge from this very localized problem solving. So again, we're back at the sort of global versus local telos and optimization issue, which is super fundamental here. And I think we certainly agree. Well, sorry, do you want to jump in on that?
Well, I want to return to the point about Darwin as the Newton of the grass blade or not, but I want you to finish your thought, and then we'll go back to that.
Well, I was only just going to quickly jump over to consciousness as either emergent from or coextensive with self-organization in some sense, or emergent from or coextensive with relationality, and like practical contact, like things are actually touching each other and reciprocally forming each other in this relational manner. Right. And that, you and I would both agree, that's the necessary corollary of evolutionary reasoning writ large. It's relational all the way down. I often say, evolution and ecology are like two sides of the same coin. Again, evolution is diachronic relations. Ecology is synchronic relations, so they're both very much like relational ways of thinking. Yeah. And I think we did definitely get into this last time in terms of the existence of continua in nature. And yes, humans are continuous with, our immediate ancestors and yada, 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 all the way back to some kind of LUCA, whether that's a cell or a, population or an ecosystem in the hot spring sense.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there's a lot of continuity, and every trait is like that. Although sometimes and this is another big thing in evolutionary reasoning, sometimes we lose the transitional forms, or we can't access them or reconstruct them for some reason. Either they're just gone, or we don't have the observational data, or we don't have the analytical know-how or whatever to reconstruct these things. And so it can look as though this trait of interest has like popped into existence in some sort of saltatory event or de novo. And again, there are jumps in evolution as well. So there's a contiguity or continuity principle, which is super important. Gradualism, super important for the Darwinian way of thinking. And I would say it's totally legitimate, but it needs to be nuanced with all the things we kind of now know about, like, jumping genes and whole genome duplications, and just the simple fact of co-option or exaptation, which again, we can possibly get into that in more detail. But what I'm saying is we do have continuity or continua, but not every step is equal. There can be jumps. And then we get this trait that we're all obsessed with, consciousness. And we want to think about it in evolutionary terms. So we want to think about it as existing on one of these continua, like every other trait. But we also want to, or some people seem to want to, disregard the real lesson there by saying, like, there will be a bright line, or they want to draw a bright line where consciousness emerges. And I guess I'm waffling. I want you to get back in on this, because I completely agree that the more we know about processes of self-organization, and now people like Levin, Fields, and Friston are extending this into quantum, the quantum realm. It does look like there's, and of course Bayesian mechanics is central to this. It does look like these processes of self-organization and babbling, which we might get into in a minute because it's a really, really interesting way of framing it, seem to go all the way down. But I guess here's the question again, and I'm just throwing your question back at you, really. Is self-organization consciousness? Or, I know you don't use the term consciousness. You want to use maybe sentience or experience in a Whiteheadian sense, or percipience now, or pansensism. Pansensism was an actual movement with Italian philosophers in the Renaissance, I think. So
yeah,
part of it just hinges on how we use these words, right?
Yeah, I mean, metaphysics as experiments on language is what we got into last time. So yeah, it is a linguistic game to some extent, but I think it's not just that. Makes it seem like it's like nominalism is valid, and I don't think that's true. But of course, our symbol systems are arbitrary with respect to the things they're supposed to represent, and so nonetheless, there's like there's a kind of etymological reason to use words in certain ways, which is an evolutionary way of thinking about language, right? And so we don't want to just totally disconnect the history of word use and the evolution of language itself from the meaning, even though when we do math, we come up with symbols and define them in whatever ways we want. So we have this capacity to use language arbitrarily, right? But I think there's strong reasons to believe that there's more to language than that. And as frustrated as some people are with Whitehead's use of language at times, I think he himself was really trying to pay careful attention to the semantic histories of the words he was using. And he didn't just, when he invented a new word and when he kept an old word, he did so deliberately, even if he meant to change the meaning of an old word like feeling. He wanted to carry the connotation and apply a new meaning and generate, through the contrast of the novelty he's introducing with the history of the meaning of the term. That's part that in that tension is the novelty of his philosophy. But so yeah, there's so much in what you were sharing, and the relations. Let me speak to that. Whether we call it experience or prehension or feeling, the point is, yeah, it's relations all the way down. There are no independent things in the universe. Everything's related to everything else, with greater or lesser relevance, right? Some things are more intimately related than other things. And for Whitehead, he thought that, like right at the beginning of Process and Reality, he makes this argument that relationality or togetherness, as he refers to it, only makes sense as like the togetherness of any two or more things only makes sense as togetherness in experience. He thought there was no other way for entities to be together in a metaphysical sense except as togetherness in experience. And so that gives you some insight into what he means by experience as this like not a substantial separately existing subject which has experience as one of its properties, right? But a experience as this almost that's that by virtue of which each of us remains perpetually incomplete because we need the relationships. We need our relationships in order to be what we are, and those relationships are always continually unfolding and changing. And so for Whitehead, that's just how he defines experience, is that being in relationship and becoming in relationship.
And I actually really like that because I think it does give due deference to the history of the word. And I mean, I just Googled it, the dictionary definition of the word, and practical contact is like the first thing that appears there.
Yeah.
So it's like, how are you going to define experience other than as things coming together and like touching each other or prehending each other in some way?
Right. Right.
Yes. So
Yeah.
I think he does a good job there with his, evolutionary reverse engineering of the language,
Right.
unsurprisingly.
But this other thing I wanted to return to is the question of Darwin as the Newton of the grass blade, because I think it speaks to the role of the organism and ontogeny, or the development of an individual organism in the evolutionary process, and that Darwin in the Origin of Species, he's giving a mechanism for speciation, which presupposes individual organisms. And so it's really a theory of phylogeny, and it's not telling us anything about the individual organism. It presupposes self-organizing beings in order for as Dennett would refer to it, the Darwinian algorithm to do any work. Dennett would try to say you can have, as long as you can have replication, you don't need a self-organizing whole. You can already get this Darwinian process to occur. But there's an emergence. I agree with you that there's as we talked about last time, a role for strong emergence in evolutionary explanation. There's continuity, but there's also leaps which occur, and the emergence of the first living cell is clearly a great example of a major evolutionary transition, right? The most important one, at least in biology. The cell, as Whitehead says, the cell is the atom of biology. And in some sense, okay, so if we grant that there's something new happening with biological forms of self-organization, the question then becomes, well, but what's still continuous with chemical, molecular, and galactic and stellar forms of self-work, because they're all self-organizing, right?
Mhm.
But clearly there's a ramp up in the capacity for this particular characteristic, which we call experience, once you get a living cell.
Mhm.
Um, because living cells seem to be able to represent their environments in a way that molecules and atoms and stars and galaxies, to the extent we can tell so far, aren't. They can't represent their environment in the same way.
Yeah, absolutely. On the Darwin thing, does Darwin presuppose organisms? Yeah, but I mean, you need organisms for natural selection. You don't need organisms for evolution, right? And natural selection is just a manifestation of a much more general evolutionary logic. And Darwin knew that. And by the time of Descent of Man in particular, he's sort of saying, I may have previously overestimated how much of a role natural selection played. And of course, he famously is proposing sexual selection, but he's also saying that there are probably a bunch of other things going on here.
Right. I wasn't fair to Darwin earlier. When I said that he neglected the agency of organisms, that's only in the origin of species. If you factor in sexual selection, there's a little bit more role for agency there.
Well, I think even in Origin of Species, he does, gives some deference to the role of the
Behavior.
organism. But, I'm not too sure that he's trying to propose, I think Darwin was a very humble guy. Um,
Oh yeah.
and very deep thinking plodder. I mean, obviously famously he had natural selection 20 years before he published, and he wanted to do a bunch of work on barnacles and worms and orchids and all of it. He was like a very great empiricist and a deep thinking, but kind of slightly retiring and humble guy. I don't think, I think sometimes these massive claim, I mean, clearly his work had a huge impact, and that is a testament to the profundity of something that he did put his finger on. Again, he was very far from the first person to put his finger on that, but he managed to articulate some manifestations of the logic of evolutionary process in a way that probably with unparalleled rigor up to that point.
Yeah.
And the rigor comes from the combination of examples that he uses to articulate this thing. And of course, we can find lots of problems with the examples that he chooses, and there are issues with the analogy of artificial selection with natural selection, and it's very far from a complete theory of even biological evolution. It's just a very, very significant piece of the puzzle, I would say.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think self-organization just is evolution, right? Like I think, and I think, Bayesian mechanics again is kind of formalizing that by showing that in the basement, at the basement level, the kind of formalism that applies to systems at all these different scales and what they're doing equally applies to evolutionary lineages and applies to individual organisms and what they're doing moment for moment as they are embodying their generative models of the world. Embodying a generative model of the world is being adapted to your environment, is being in relation with your environment, is conforming in a way, like is conforming whilst remaining differentiated, conforming with whilst remaining differentiated from your environment. Like these are all different time scales, different organizational scales of a basic evolutionary logic that natural selection is also, an example of. And just on the ontogeny side of things, I think it's really just important again to look at the history of the use of the term evolution in biology prior to Darwin, and what Darwin was drawing on, both in terms of what he'd studied as a younger man and what he was intuitively drawing on as the tradition of evolutionary reasoning that he was emerging from, the tradition of nascent biology that he was emerging from. And the term evolution first appears in biology in the context of development of the embryo to the adult organism. So, I like to say development is the evolution of the individual. And that turns out to be not a very interesting original thing to say at all, even though, when I used to say that in conversation with my, evolutionary biologist colleagues, they'd be like, oh, no, 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 evolution is and development are two different things. Don't conflate ontogeny and phylogeny. And that's what Ernst Haeckel did. And we need to, but the truth is, it was first, like the word was first brought into biology to describe that, and really to describe a kind of deterministic or preformationist model of that ontogeny.
Yeah.
But the basic logic was in some sense, isomorphic between, for the development of the individual and the evolution of lineages is there from the beginning in biology. Darwin took that for granted. He could take that for granted because that's what he was building on.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you look at the work again of someone like Michael Levin right now, and Levin and Fields have a paper specifically on a scale-free approach to biology, which is looking at the again ontogeny and phylogeny as different scales, manifestations of the same kind of scale-free process. But that's also not even, I mean, it's a great paper, but it's not necessarily an original way of thinking even within contemporary biological theory. Like it's one of the major responses to the species problem. What is a species? Well, a species is a lineage, as well as being this individual critter that comes to embody the essence, the emergent essence, the essence that emerged from the evolutionary process of its particular species. So these things are always very, very much interwoven, I would say.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I agree, but I'm curious about how far you take that analogy between ontogeny and phylogeny. I mean, if so, an individual animal, a multicellular animal, is a lineage
Yeah.
of cells that construct their own niche, an ecosystem that's made out of themselves, in a
Mm-hmm.
larger ecosystem. But there's a certain goal directedness of that activity. There is it's not all, I don't think of it as information stored in the genome, because it's just as much, if there's information involved, stored in the environment that the ancestors of this particular organism developed within.
So
The
in the
information,
relationship between the genome and the environment and etc. Yeah,
right? The
it's still depending
information is relationship. It's not stored here or there. It's not
yeah.
simply located. But in any event, there's a telos to ontogeny, and
Mm-hmm.
Aristotle is the master of that, drawing the metaphysics, drawing out an ontology from the development of organisms, right?
Mm-hmm.
But Darwin seems to be in the level of phylogeny and speciation. Darwin generally is associated with the view, right, that there's a kind of fanning out of variation, and it's not necessarily going to lead. There's a lot of, I mean, this is related to the criticisms of Gaia theory, the idea of some superorganism, that all species in some way are like the cells existing within, and ultimately all serving the purpose of maintaining the ecosphere of the earth,
Mm-hmm.
regulating the habitat of all of life. But in other words, to sum up my point, my question for you, if you make this analogy between ontogeny and phylogeny, isn't there, I mean, how far does the telos evident at the level of individuals extend to populations and the whole earth?
Yeah. I mean, look, it's the same. It's exactly what we've been talking about since the beginning, global telos and
Yeah.
local telos, and how do these things combine or interact? It's the question of firstness. Again, how much of the telos needs to be there from the beginning? Like with the Gaia thing, of course, there's a sense in which the biosphere is this emergent, integrated, system. And if you massively perturb, one set of relations or one set of subsystems within that, you might perturb the function of the whole thing. But then, oops, I already said the function of the whole thing. Does that mean it has some kind of, externally validated telos to the whole thing? I mean, we have a lot of trouble thinking about how, and of course, I don't have the answers, and I'm not pretending to, but about how telos emerges from contingency. But actually, I would say we see that happening at the fine-grained level in evolutionary systems all the time. So you see something kind of well, you see a range of variation which is more or less like noisy or stochastic, at least from our perspective. It's like, oh, there's all this stuff going on here, and the organism is in some way continually, we talked about this last time, but is in some way continually canalizing this variation, and that's happening again in ontogeny. And again, Michael Levin talks about this really, really nicely. You've got, changes in gene expression happening, and then this emergent whole that is canalizing this, lower level of variation. Well, that's exactly the way people think classically about natural selection, in terms of random mutation being then selected by the environment. And again, that is kind of the basic logic of evolutionary reasoning, that at every level of the scale, you've got a process that generates variation, and you've got a reciprocal process which selects a subset of that variation. And the cosmological question is, could we have started with just a process that generates variation and no principles of selection? And could the principles of selection emerge from within the stochastic or whatever random process? Random is obviously like a real buzzword, so we might need to specifically unpack that if we're going to use it. But could these processes that canalize, so could we have order, emergent order is what I was trying to say. That's a neologism for you.
I like that one.
Yeah, emergent order from chaos. So this again, it's this. It's archetypal, which is in itself, a reference to these kind of forms. But it's the creation myth logic all over again. It's like everywhere you look, you find these creation myths in which there is some kind of fundamental, process of chaos, and then a, ancillary process, be it a god or whatever it might be, that emerges and breathes order or bequeaths order, provides the first selection principles. And so we have a really hard time not just bringing in a selection principle, like positing a selection principle from the beginning, like love or God or whatever it might be. And maybe that's just where our reasoning kind of bottoms out in some sense. Like we have to posit a selection principle to get things going, in terms of the chain of reasoning. Or maybe that's the way it actually is. Like maybe, this could also be talked about in terms of the coexistence of the actual and the potential in some sense, right? Maybe you can't just have potential. Maybe you need to have actual, and actual is the selection principle. Like whatever is already present is going to select for variation that exists only in potential. And so we always end up with this two-term philosophy, like two-term logic in evolutionary reasoning. So I'm not answering your question at all, other than saying like it is the fundamental question in some sense. Yeah. But I think we can see how in lineages which are extended in time, over very large periods of time, and have different mechanisms for stabilizing certain kinds of variation that has been selected from the individual, which is happening at a much condensed period of time, and therefore has its set of built-in selection mechanisms, and things like causal closure of constraints and all of these sorts of things are the organism level selection mechanisms which are canalizing variation that's happening at the level of Brownian motion or transcriptional babbling. Now I can't get this idea out of my head, so we might need to talk about that as a process of generating variation. But so we're looking at the same logic, but we're looking at different mechanisms, if I'm allowed to use that word, for mediating the process that generates the variation and the thing that selects it. There are different manifestations of that at different scales, basically, but the same logic seems to apply. And that's necessarily going to, in some way, interact with this question of, yes, the obviously ontogeny is very goal oriented, whereas the lineage as a whole might be less so, and that might be something that emerges out of, again, the way
Mm.
heritability works, and that sort of
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah, and of course, at the level of ontogeny, there's a tremendous amount of contingency, and we're not just talking about a copy machine. We're talking about unique individuals which carry variations, which is why that's what
Yeah,
drives the whole evolutionary process. And
exactly.
so, yeah, that's all very helpful, and I think it's listening to you helped me realize that we can't artificially separate these two scales. The species level and the individual level are in fact overlapping, and that the whole logic is the relationship between wholes and parts of different scales.
Mm.
And but this okay, so we're an hour and 11 minutes into this, and we've gotten to the question of whether we need a first principle of some kind to provide order or urger, as you put it, which is very, I like that neologism for what Whitehead says, what Whitehead refers to as divine eros,
Mm.
Greek
Yeah.
term for like desire, eros. Urger is a good way of capturing what he means by the order of a cosmic epoch being in some sense derived from this initial aim
Mm.
coming from the divine nature, which is the first condition placed upon creativity. And creativity would be Whitehead's equivalent of the quantum babble, I think.
Mm.
It's
Mhm.
just, there's no order yet, but you can't really, you mentioned randomness, and it's like, it seems to me it takes a really refined intellect to even approach creating randomness. Like, we really need to work hard to
Mm.
create randomness
Mm.
in like a random number generator or something. It's not easy to do that. And so like, and it's not even
It's not even
actually,
random.
it's not right. So there's no such thing as pure chaos. There's no such thing as pure order, right? And Whitehead, in thinking about metaphysical first principles, is like, look, creativity is the universal of universals. We encounter, we don't encounter anything else in our experience other than creativity, and it's the principle of unrest, right? It's that we're perpetually perishing. We're constantly passing beyond ourselves, right? This is the process of process ontology. It's creativity, but creativity only comes in under conditions, right? It's
Mm.
always, it's self-limiting, because there is something rather than nothing. We can say that creativity is in the business of producing creatures, and God, for Whitehead, is the first creature.
Mhm.
And as the first creature, God lays down this initial aim, or this primordial
Constraint.
constraint, exactly. And
Mm.
it's a postulate,
Yeah.
right, that he's making that allows the evolutionary process to get going, right? And we can say, well, we don't really need that, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure how else to start. If we're going to be rational in our evolutionary accounts of where we came from, and how we got to where we are, we need to start somewhere. And where we start, the ground of reason cannot itself be rational. And,
Mm.
Whitehead just comes out and says that God is the ultimate irrationality
Mm.
because it is
But
the basis for all further
yeah.
reasons.
But I feel like that's positing, by positing the ground of reason, you are saying that there is no pure irrationality in some sense as well, because you are there, you're positing the initial selection principle, that gets things going, right?
This is why Whitehead says that science is rooted in faith, faith
Mm.
in the reasonableness of things, right?
Yeah. Uh, so Michael Levin brought that up in the. I don't know if you've seen the recent chat on Kurt
Theory
John
of everything.
Michaels.
I was
Yeah.
just watching it, and I got through the first half hour before we started chatting. So
Okay, it's pretty amazing, actually. It's a really, really great chat, and it's one of the reasons why I'm like really enthusiastic about babbling right now. Um, but at the end, spoiler alert for you and anyone who hasn't watched it, Michael Levin talks about that exactly that, the faith that we have in the intelligibility of the world. I don't think he uses that term exactly, but it's certainly one you and I have used in discussion. And I wonder if that is faith, because in some sense it's, I mean, yeah, you can come up with some sort of really exotic thought experiment in which an evil demon, you can be a Cartesian skeptic, or you can talk about simulation theory or something like that. But then that's only going to be deferring the problem really anyway. You're going to have some sort of infinite regress on that side of things. I mean, is it faith that the world's intelligible? We interact effectively with the world, and this is very much, it's what science is predicated on, but it's totally pre-scientific, obviously. I mean, it's what organisms do in general.
Yeah.
And so like intelligibility is a condition of our existence. I don't know, do we have to take that on faith, or is it actually the thing that we have the most empirical evidence for, is
Mm.
that we can act effectively, and that means that we can intervene effectively, and that means the patterns that we're tracking are in fact real. So that we're not systematically deluded and mistaken, although some people claim that we are. And there are ways in which we are, but they're relatively trivial, I would suggest, in comparison to the fact that the world just keeps showing up for us, and we keep being able to interact in time-tested ways. Are we taking this on faith, or are we taking this on massive amounts of primary evidence? And what's
I
the
mean,
difference?
yeah. I mean, it comes down to, I would suggest, the problem of induction,
Sure.
and to what extent we are justified in generalizing from particular experiences to some law, some universal characteristic of things. And to the extent that science affords us access to universals, even if they're habits, but there seems to be something deeper, at least in Whitehead's view, and I'm open on this question and trying to figure it out. But to the extent that we can see laws of nature as contingently emergent, right?
Mm-hmm.
Historically
Mm-hmm.
emergent. Does that mean that there aren't certain constants below that, or a certain degree of fine tuning? Whether we're talking about like constants are measured, but then there are these other elements that come out of the math that seem to be, they couldn't have been otherwise, or that the way that they are couldn't be changed even to the millionth of a decimal, and without preventing heavier elements and thus life and consciousness from emerging. And so this question of fine tuning remains open, whether or not we accept the Whiteheadian or the Peircean idea of more special laws as historically emergent, right? So if Whitehead's view was that if science is possible, we need more than just historically emergent habits. There must be something, not just if science is possible, but if metaphysics is possible. There must be something, some deeper principles at work which are not themselves historically emergent, but required for emergence of order of any kind. Yeah.
So, I mean, Whitehead has these eternal objects, right? I like to say habits of the infinite, but
Nice,
it's
nice
that kind
word.
of
I like that.
that, it's that kind of thing, right? It firstness again.
Habits of
What?
the infinite would be, that's the primordial nature of God in a sense.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
that's because God is an actuality, and
Mhm.
God is envisaging and valuing the realm of eternal objects, and thus giving them some, yeah, tendency or habit right? So habits of the infinite, habits of the eternal, you could say that's God's role. But when we want to consider
Yeah.
eternal objects in abstraction,
Mhm.
they don't exist apart from anything actual. You
Mm.
can't, we certainly, we as finite creatures and not even God can't access them independent of an actual world. But nonetheless, they seem required for us to characterize or describe anything actual, right?
Mm. Yeah, but then again, we're so heavily embedded in this contingent history that, you know, we're created of the same principles of order that everything else is created from. So of course we require them in order to abstract, to
Mm-hmm.
reason abstractly about, you know, the situation that we actually find ourselves in. I mean, I'm not trying to sweep the issue under the rug, because I think it's like the issue. It's the topic of this whole conversation because it's the firstness thing, right? And I think there are lots of really interesting things to say that are totally inconclusive about that, and I
Mm-hmm.
would like to say some of those things. But just on the problem of induction and the faith thing again, yeah, I mean, the problem of induction obviously is a very famous problem in the history of philosophy, and various people have claimed to have solved it. And but I think Whitehead, nails it in some sense. I think relational philosophy doesn't have a problem of induction, in some sense, right? Because the contingent historical relations are what stabilize reality and what ensure that it is, contiguous, continuous from moment to moment. And that's why I think Meillassoux hyper chaos thing, I think in some sense he's seeing very deeply when he's doing exactly what we're doing, and he's saying that he ultimately is saying something like contingency comes first, right? Which again is hardly original. It's the typical chaos, and then we have emergent order thing.
Mm-hmm.
But he then sees that as leaving us vulnerable to this hyper chaos thing, which is that, the problem of induction remains an issue for him, in the sense that because contingency is first, we could revert to abject contingency at any moment.
Mm-hmm.
And, that kind of logic is very prevalent in, like, exotic extrapolations from thermodynamics or whatever,
Ghost
like Boltzmann
membranes and stuff.
brains.
Yeah.
Snap. Yeah. So there's an intuition there, but I think that another thing we've talked about potentially discussing is assembly theory. Like assembly theory is an attempt to solve that in some sense, because it's about how contingent pathways lead to possible construction of certain possible molecules, and the historical aspect is in some sense what stabilizes, and facilitates access to the adjacent possible, and etc. So I think if you've got a strong relational component in your evolutionary model, then the problem of induction starts to look like a highly abstract problem. And I think even Hume recognized this. Like, you do your philosophy and you do your very abstract thinking in your office, but when you go out and you don't step out the second floor window because you have any doubt that that's going to be a dangerous thing to do or whatever, in your normal daily life you act in accordance with the conventions and customs of the society that you find yourself in, and you believe. And so here you can say you're taking it on faith, but you take the massive amount of evidence that you've got that things are going to continue being relatively stable. Again, you can say you take it on faith, but I kind of wonder what that means. I mean, is it faith if we have this incredibly huge amount of evidence for it? And I think, just as an aside, this is sort of how people misunderstand maybe certain schools of ancient skepticism as well. Like, if you read Sextus Empiricus and he's commenting on Pyrrhonian skepticism, it's a totally pragmatic, way of life kind of philosophy. It's like, do your abstract reasoning, but don't believe any of that stuff. When it comes down to, daily life, though, you act in accordance with custom. You act in such a way as, physical objects in the world are going to continue to do what they've always done, like you act as organisms have always done. And is that an act of faith? I'm just not sure. It seems so concrete to me that it's hard to say that it's an act of faith.
Well, the way in which the future is imminent in the present,
Mm,
and our capacity as human conscious animals to relate to the future as something imminent in the present, Whitehead is wanting to generalize. And so, in a way, what Hume is content to bifurcate into, the realm of practical action
yeah,
and human affairs, and the realm of nature and science,
mm,
scientific knowledge, Whitehead's like, no, we need to be more coherent than that.
mm,
Metaphysics is important because it allows us to generalize, so as to avoid such bifurcations. And so, in some ways, what Hume left in the domain of practice, custom, habit, and so on, Whitehead's like, well, that's how nature operates, right?
yeah,
And so, and yet, Whitehead's not Humean. He's not a skeptic about our ability to have scientific
mm,
knowledge of
mm,
causality. He's like,
mm,
Hume's presupposing it in his own deconstruction of it. Um, and so Whitehead wants to preserve something like what Kant meant by synthetic a priori knowledge.
mm, mm,
But it's just that for Whitehead, we don't gain that knowledge, that we don't gain that knowledge by constructing by reducing nature to mere appearance
mm,
constructed by our mind. We
mm,
have synthetic a priori knowledge because of this experiential continuum binding us to the entire history of nature, such that in each moment of our present experience is included the entire past history of the universe from our particular perspective and light cone, and a an anticipation of futures which are possible given the past that we're inheriting, and that the structure of experience is such that knowledge of this sort, and that such that induction is justified, such that scientific knowledge is possible. But it's a kind of scientific knowledge of nature, or I should say, it's a picture of nature very different from what Kant imagined or what Newton
mm,
imagined. It's nature, it's full-blooded nature in
mm,
Whitehead's sense, right? He's an organic realist, and so when we know something, we are entering into relationship with other organisms. So knowledge becomes relational rather than transcendental. And so I think Whitehead's always trying to have it both ways, or like overcome these dichotomies in the history of philosophy. And I think, is it faith in the intelligibility of nature that drives science? I think that's accurate to say, but faith here just means it's a reference to the structure of experience and the way in which, in the most concrete sense we can imagine it, the present moment is open to the past and the future,
mm,
right? And so it's not solipsistically isolated, cut off from what has occurred before in such a way that we could, like Maya's imagine that, anything could happen in the next moment. It's just as likely as order having emerged initially. Like, all the order could just disappear tomorrow. Well, no, there's a principle of confirmation to the past that's in some way, yeah, a priori. It's the structure of experience. It's a metaphysical structure, Whitehead is saying. And it's phenomenological in the sense that he's trying to describe our human experience, but in a general enough way that it applies also to vector transmission of energy in physics, that it applies also to, you know, the evolution of species and so on. It's a metaphysical principle, the whole idea of concrescence, that's general enough that it applies to all these different special cases, right? And if human experience is an exemplification of this metaphysical process of concrescence that is also operative everywhere else, induction is justified. Scientific knowledge is possible. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, faith is a loaded word, and maybe
mm.
we could.
Because I think it's closer to common sense, to be honest.
Sure.
Uh, and that doesn't mean it's not, that's not necessarily mutually exclusive with certain definitions of faith. As you say, it's a very loaded word and it means very different things.
Well, yeah, because
Uh,
skeptics are willing to throw common sense out the window. Uh, in certain scientific rationalists who are
mm,
skeptical about our
mm,
intuitions, say, and our common
uh,
sense, are willing to throw it out the window. And I agree. It gets common sense can seem like faith, like belief in the adequacy of common sense
mm.
for the purposes of science and metaphysics. For a scientific skeptic, is going to seem like an unjustified
Yeah, but
position.
I think they've got it, as we would say in Australia and maybe in California as well, arse backwards.
Yeah.
Because the
Uh,
position that really requires faith is the position of the, I guess we could call this the Cartesian skeptic with reference
mm,
to the evil demon idea. And I think skepticism or to be skeptical, it's another incredibly loaded word and it means really different things in different traditions. Because I do think, as I was saying before, that there's at least pretty good evidence that certain ancient Greek schools of skepticism or certain ancient Greek skeptics, maybe, because even there's going to be a lot of heterogeneity, did affirm common sense. They
mm,
didn't necessarily affirm, meta narratives or abstract reasoning as revealing something true about the nature of
sure.
reality. So they were more Humean in that sense. Than they maybe so maybe the world was bifurcated for them in some sense. But a big part of the reason that they were skeptical about more abstract propositional knowledge is because they were trying to achieve ataraxia, right? They didn't want to get too attached to anything that then might turn out to be false, or that they might feel stupid in a rhetorical situation. If some other sophist defeated their argument, they didn't want that to have a big emotional impact on them,
Mm,
but they wanted nonetheless to take part in sort of public philosophy, I think.
mm-hmm.
So it's like an apotropaic principle. I won't really believe or invest in all of that stuff. I'll only believe in what's really concrete and undeniable, and that's sort of the facts of common sense. And I think that Whitehead, as you're describing him there, that's a advanced common sense. That's a generalization from the lived experience to what we know about the way science is done and how science comes out of the lived experience. And so I think, in a sense, the faith, at least in the sort of slightly pejorative sense that a lot of contemporary, scientific skeptics would use the term faith, I think they're actually way more invested in that faith-based view that it could be, like belief in the, you know, the reality of certain abstract things,
Yeah.
be that other universes, be that a simulation hypothesis, be that a brain in a vat kind of thing. Belief in the idea that we could, like, giving a decent amount of credence. I mean, sure, we can't rule these things out, and
Mm,
again, we can't really refute solipsism or whatever. It's just not very interesting, right? So we can't rule things out, but giving that any any credence, almost like anything above that basement level of, well, I can't rule it out, but now I'm ready to move on. That's using, like, faith is more operative in that position, I would say, than in the position of like generalizing the actual concrete nature
mm,
of reality as it reveals itself to us as we're embedded in it moment to moment, and saying that science is just
yeah.
a rarefied example of that sort of. And again, that leads back to the kind of Bayesian view,
Mm,
coming from, like, again, Bayesian statistics as a kind of generalized formal model of evolutionary process, and it applies just as much to evolutionary epistemology and therefore science as a practice as it does to what organisms are doing moment to moment, as it does to maybe the evolution of the cosmos as a whole. And that, again, it requires this contiguity. How can you do inference? How
mm-hmm.
can you update your priors into more informative or more useful posteriors, unless you are assuming, I mean, on faith, if you want, this continuity? So what you were saying about Whitehead also fits really nicely with, say, like predictive processing as the cognitive manifestation of the free energy principle, or this Bayesianist research program. And that, again, that just requires what is common sense, which is that the world is going to be, it's constantly changing, but it's changing in ways that are constrained historically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. And then you have people like Donald Hoffman who
Hmm.
would say that any display, any experiential display is necessary. He thinks he can prove statistically, I guess, that any display that an organism generates, any generative model, is necessarily going to be false, because if it were true, it wouldn't have survived, because truth is not adaptive, and so it's this strange
Yeah,
attempt to
I,
preserve
I don't.
solipsism.
Yeah, well, I don't want to, straw man Donald Hoffman. I'm not intimately familiar with his views. I did buy his book, but never read it. So,
Mm-hmm.
but I've
Doesn't really
seen.
exist anyway, so.
Yeah, exactly. Um, I was systematically deluded by my, generative model into believing that there was a book called Against Reality, or what's it called? I can't remember now.
I think that's right.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and but I've seen him. I've listened to a number of podcasts and stuff, and I know that he works with Chris Fields and other, like, very, people I have a lot of respect for, and so I'm sure Donald Hoffman has some very sophisticated
For sure.
science
I'm caricaturing the
understood.
view, no doubt about it.
But I'm gonna keep caricaturing it, because if you look at, I think I got to his book in the first chapter where he presents, and maybe it's just the first toy model. It's a simplification of the models that he's actually using to
Yeah.
derive his arguments from. But it's like, if you've got two functions, truth and fitness, and you plug those into your models and they are already bifurcated, and then you find out that fitness wins to the exclusion of truth. It kind of seems like, well, the rabbit you're pulling out of the hat is the rabbit that you put into the hat, in some sense. Like, those are obviously not going to track.
Yeah.
Whereas, well, fitness is obviously not going to track truth if you make them discrete, from each other in the first place.
Yeah.
And again, I'm sure there's a lot more going on than that, but it seems to me that there are a lot of very sophisticated, philosophical views, and views even in contemporary cognitive science, which find a way of navigating between these two, between the Scylla and Charybdis of fitness and truth, or whatever. It's like,
Yeah.
we might have only aspectual access to reality. So again, we might be organisms in our organism specific and even individual specific Umwelten. So I see the world as it appears to me. It's slightly different from the way that it appears to you, but it's, we share a great deal because we're part of the same, species, as part of the same organismal lineage, and that will as we go back through the great organismal lineage that all life is part of, if we're kind of being a bit Darwinian here, we're going to move further and further away. As we move further and further away phylogenetically, there might be more discrepancy between our Umwelten. A snail is perceiving the world in a very different way to the way that I do, but that doesn't in any sense invalidate the idea that what the snail's representation of the world is true, but it contains affordances that are relevant to snails, which are generally not very relevant to me, but maybe I can discover them scientifically. As Uexküll basically thought, and I think he maybe went a bit far with this, but he sort of thought we could, basically using behavioral and anatomical science, we could reconstruct the Umwelten of all other organisms, right? We could work out, and to some extent that's true, unless we mean we could, in some Thomas Nagel type sense, realize the experience of what it's like to be a snail. Like, I don't think I'm likely ever to know that. I don't know, maybe virtual reality in the future. But I mean, what I'm getting at.
Mm-hmm.
So it's quite possible to say that to be a perspectivalist or
Yeah.
an aspectualist or something like that, and still have a robust monism, ontological monism, which is what, so you might be epistemically, in some sense, very plural. Like, we might all have slightly different epistemic access.
Yeah.
And again, you use the evolutionary model of within a particular fine-grained lineage, everyone has more similar epistemic access, and as you move across the tree of life, it gets further, more and more discrepancies are going to be there. But
Yeah.
that in no sense implies an ontological dualism, and it in no sense implies some kind of abject skepticism where I would say that he's, again, in the caricaturish way that we're presenting it, it's basically violating the logic of natural selection itself, because effective intervention, usefulness, the possibility of functional traits relies on them tracking something that is, in a meaningful sense, true. It's not like absolute ultimate truth. It's a kind of conventional truth,
Right.
but that is the kind of truth that's relevant and useful.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, it's too abstract and idealistic a conception of truth that gets plugged into this model from the beginning.
Seems
A Laplacian idea of truth as the view from the
mm,
outside or
yeah.
something, and that just that doesn't exist. And I think Whitehead's instructive here because for him, truth is the problem with a true proposition is it's just not that interesting,
Mhm.
and life is it's it's an aesthetic affair for Whitehead. It's more about what's interesting. It's more about what's important, what's relevant, and relevance realization, as John Vervaeke would say, is what's essential to cognition, not the
Mhm.
search for some sense of truth independent of one's own interests and situation.
Mm.
And so, where do we get this idea of truth? I mean, that we would even hold up as an ideal that we can't reach. I think it seems to me to be a function of model centrism, which is a kind. When you were speaking earlier about the faith that some thinkers can have in a particular model, as though it's as though it's certainly the case of
Mm.
reality,
Mm.
that becomes a kind of idolatry, and that form of faith in a model functions in a very religious way. You're worshiping an idol, and it seems to me that what should distinguish science from that form of idolatrous religion, and there's plenty of iconoclasm in religion, so I'm not trying to put religion down, but the scientific method is one wherein models should always be considered to be toys, right?
Mm.
And we should acknowledge from the get go that every model is wrong, but some are less wrong than others, you know. And I like for this reason to distinguish between model making, and model testing in science and ontology, because sometimes people think of ontology, oh well, it's your model of the world.
Mm.
It's like, well, I want to think of ontology and the whole enterprise of metaphysics as a descriptive generalization from experience,
Mm.
and rather than just saying ontology is about model making, no, ontology and metaphysics, we're trying to get at what's concrete, and we're trying to for Whitehead, I mean, philosophy is the critic of abstraction.
Mm.
And so if we just reduce ontology to model making writ large, I feel like we lose the opportunity to pursue or to stay attentive to the ways in which concrete experience will always transcend any model we could ever hope
Mm.
uh,
Mm.
to elaborate. And yet we can still do metaphysics if we stick to this speculative method, something like what Whitehead laid out of descriptive generalization,
Mm.
seeking coherence, seeking adequacy, to generalize from our experience rather than to replace experience with a model or to have the
Mm.
model stand in for what's concretely available to us.
Yeah, no, I love that. I mean, part of what we're performing this descriptive generalization on, though, is our experience of certain models
Mm.
giving us a grip on the world. So, a
Yeah.
certain model that affords an effective intervention that didn't exist in the absence of that model is therefore tracking something true that then becomes grist for the mill of this descriptive generalization.
So
But
every sense organ is a model of some aspect of the world, in other words, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that absolutely true. But even our little, little, I entirely want to trivialize them, although I want to get to triviality again in a second. But our mathematical models, our computational models, etc., to the extent that they can then, be empirically, tested against the world, and that they provide us with a certain kind of insight that enables us to fine tune our grip on the world a little bit more. So, like technology is an obvious example. They must be tracking, according to the faith of the intelligibility of the world and all of that. They must be tracking some real patterns in the world. So there's something in the structure of that model. But the problem with the model centrism, as you're describing it, is the idea that this model is thereby complete, whereas going back to the perspectivalism thing,
Yeah.
we not only have individual perspectives as organisms, but our models are perspectives, and they're tracking aspects. And but just because they give us some kind of grip on a particular aspect of reality doesn't mean we should, reify them into complete descriptions of, life, the universe, and everything, right? And those descriptions to, part of the sort of almost phenomenological but very empirical point that Whitehead is making there is like those descriptions have to always be linked back into lived experience, where everything kind of begins and ends.
Mm-hmm.
We start there and we have to cache things out there as well. So that's a fundamental constraint on our descriptive generalizations.
Right.
But part of what doing metaphysics is, as I understand it, is also taking, and I mean, I know you agree, taking all of the results of the special sciences, a lot of which are model based,
Mm-hmm.
and applying them to this bigger, descriptive generalization. Although there's the question there, is that does that I mean, there's a bunch of questions that I have on what you were saying, but when you use the term descriptive generalization, is that can that actually also be an explanatory model? And that's part of what we're talking about in this whole conversation again, because when we talk about firstness and evolutionary models, we're like, what do we require ontologically to be first to explain the appearance of things as they currently appear, not just to describe?
Yeah. Well, it could be that the primordial nature of God in Whitehead's sense, or some ordering of the eternal objects, is
Mm.
required for,
Mm.
actual coherent experience to emerge.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that having the complete formalism that describes that primordial nature, that would explain what is
Mm.
now concrete, because there's tons of contingency in the evolutionary process, yeah, that is fed by this divine element, but that is not explained by it. And I mean, explanation seems to me to be useful, but it always amounts to you explain one thing in terms of another, which you take to be more fundamental. And if the universe is such that there's no bottom level, if it's process and relationship all the way down, ultimately explanations could only ever serve a kind of local pragmatic purpose for like getting a handle on something complicated by reference to its simpler components. And so, strangely enough, explanation becomes more about instrumental intervention rather than metaphysics. You're not actually,
Mm.
you might think, oh, metaphysics, that's how you explain why everything is. But no, really, metaphysics it's descriptive. We're trying
Mm.
to just, yeah, it's not explanatory in the sense that you're trying to explain away the concrete by reference to something abstract, or explain away
Not,
the whole by reference to its parts.
yeah, I mean, it's not a complete explanation. It's
Mm.
a explanation of why things that resemble the things that we see are possible. But again, I think this is the kind of Newton of the blade of grass sort of thing again, in
Mm.
some sense, is that, and it also links to what you were just saying. Whitehead was saying that a true proposition is not that interesting. Like something that's true across, is universally true, is necessarily trivial.
Mm-hmm.
And the kinds of things we have that are like that, whether they're laws of physics, or emergent things, or emerging things like Bayesian mechanics or whatever, they are sort of free energy principle. trivial principles in a certain sense, and this applies to the logic of evolution in general. It's a trivial principle. So when I say trivial, it doesn't mean I don't love it and think it's amazing or whatever, but it in itself is powerless to explain the particular arrangement of things as we see them. Like you need exactly as you're saying, you need a lot of very fine-grained detail looking at a local system, and you understand that it's constrained by those principles. It's not going to, violate relativity in some way, or violate, probably Newton even in some way, and it's not going to violate basic evolutionary principles. Those
Yeah.
are fundamental constraints which
Yeah.
enable it to be what it is, but
Yeah.
it's doing
Yeah.
its own thing.
I mean, for Whitehead, those fundamental constraints have to do with the nature of extension, which for
Mm.
him is this super abstract category that precedes even space and time. And so the
Mm.
spatiotemporal continuum of our cosmic epoch, where relativity applies, is a special um, case of a more general um, field of potential, which he calls the extensive continuum, right?
Mm.
And so, an extension as such has to do with certain rules of Mariology and congruence and other super abstract topological ideas, which are above my pay grade. But that for Whitehead, and this is where he and John Dewey kind of butt heads, because Whitehead has this formal element to his, and this mathematical dimension to his metaphysics that for Dewey is like, oh, I love all the organicism and the
Mm.
process and the experiential embodiment and so on, but then you've got these eternal objects and this primordial nature
Mhm.
of God and like what's going on there. But I think, for Whitehead, it has to do with the the miracle of mathematical physics and the fact that we can make and logic, and the fact that we can know in such abstract ways the patterns which appear to be fundamental to everything we've ever observed.
Mm.
I think for Whitehead just couldn't get over the miraculousness of that, and so while I think instinctually I'm more of a pragmatist and
Mm.
want to go with Dewey on these issues and just emphasize that knowledge is always limited to the perspective of our existence of as organisms, and that we know as is relevant to our biological perspectives and our sensory organs and whatnot. Whitehead also has this sense of something that we are in touch cognitively with possibilities and principles which are truly abstract,
Mm.
and which are in some way required for us to know anything about
Mm.
concrete matters of fact. And so, you're asking in our first session, to what extent is my own view identical with Whitehead's? And I think here I'm like, I respect the guy and think I should take this claim of his seriously, and I'm trying to work through his rationale. I can't dismiss it, but I'm not. It wasn't my own instinctual
Sure.
point of view, So
Mm.
we'll see
I
where
mean,
I end up, but
so one of the concrete facts about us as human organisms is that we have the capacity to, reason abstractly based on the encounter with, concrete facts. We're able to derive principles that apply, much more broadly, and even seem to indicate this kind of landscape
yeah,
of relations that are not in fact actualized. And there are, this is of course still very much where theoretical physics plies its trade, and exploring parts of the mathematical universe to see whether they might underpin what the physical universe. And most people would agree that a huge percentage, or the majority of mathematical forms don't actually find physical realization. And
mm-hmm.
then you have the argument, you'd have Max Tegmark saying, yes, but they're all nonetheless real in some sense. And you would have others saying, no, that's naive Platonism or whatever, like we're still, and we will never, I suspect, escape from that. Um,
Yeah,
so there's this sense in which, even if this is all somehow contingently historical, the evolutionary process got to the point where it generated, so inferential reasoning is kind of, according to, fairly well supported models in cognitive science, I suppose, is part of what organisms in general do. So like we were talking about before, they have to track regularities in their environment in different ways. And, a kind of counterfactual reasoning is therefore, possibly, somewhere close to being fundamental as well, So there's this question of why is it this way and not that way and all of that.
Yeah.
And that requires, and again, in the sense that we've talked about in general, this seems to reach its apotheosis so far in humans, and maybe it's going to go way further in deep learning, AI and everything. And in some sense, that's all they are, is the capacity to abstract general principles from data and find this huge landscape of possibility that they can then, that they navigate in. So, this just leads us into the really deep questions that we have been, again, sort of circumambulating throughout this conversation about, does that landscape of all of these relations, which of course seem to us to be totally timeless, do they need to predate everything, or do they somehow emerge? Like, does our capacity to reason abstractly actually give birth to these landscapes in some sense? And one of the ways I like to think about this kind of thing is with music. It's like you get a set of constraints in a particular musical tradition, and they immediately seem to give birth to this, maybe not infinite, but this huge landscape of possible musical compositions or performances that exist that are constrained in the same way, but are, actually substantively very different. And this brings us back to this same point again, that these fundamental principles that are incredibly general, they are constraints, but not explanations, in the sense that every individual thing that in fact is actualized is constrained by those, but is not explained by them, because in fact these principles predict an incredibly huge landscape of variation, most of which is either not actualized, or if it is actualized, we don't have any empirical access to it. So, maybe there's this, many worlds thing going on or whatever, but like, how interesting is that if it doesn't actually make any empirical predictions or change our lived experience or whatever? But when we see these model first or abstraction first approaches, you tend to get this massive landscape of possibility, and there is a tendency towards a kind of reificatory attitude towards that. Like, well, this is all real, and maybe this is all actualized even. It's all actual, but we don't, so it's physically actualized somewhere, but we don't have access to that. And this could lead us into a discussion of Wolfram's Ruliad as well, but it seems to really fit in with this, with where Whitehead was going. And it's interesting because, one of the first things I ever got from Whitehead was the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, right? Like, it's just such a pithy little phrase, and it's like, oh, this is my great, buffer against these people who reify their models, take these abstract models as more real than the concrete reality that they're actually exposed to. And it seems to describe really nicely these views that seem to reify the entire landscape of counterfactuals, instead of trying to work out why our actual universe, as it reveals itself to us, is navigating a very particular course through this landscape of possibility. Which I kind of take to be the fundamental question in evolutionary cosmology, and maybe in evolutionary reasoning in general. If the principles lead to the generation of this massive landscape of variation, how come we only see particular variants of that? And so, again, we're asking now a question about what are the selection principles that give rise to particular, pathways through the space of possibility. But how do we approach this space of possibility? Is it the case that only the adjacent possible is real in some important way? And is it the case that the adjacent possible is a historically contingent, something that is constructed or emerges by the actual determinate arrangement of things,
Yeah.
and their proximity to variations on a theme, basically? Or is it just this massive landscape which is basically infinite, all possible universes or all possible laws, all possible rules in the Ruliad or whatever, that predates the whole thing, and is in some sense as real, so not derived from the actual state of affairs. And I mean, Whitehead seems to kind of, I don't want to accuse him of the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, right, except for a bit of fun, but he seems to kind of lean towards that slightly reificatory view of this landscape of potentia,
Yeah.
Um,
And then, I'm going to have to run in a minute because it's dinner time
oh,
here,
oh,
but
yeah,
good thing we've already tied a neat bow on all these questions. But, Whitehead always saves himself by like, he has the consequent nature of God,
yeah.
which even though
Mm.
he says the primordial nature is eternal, the consequent nature is growing with time and it's one God. So
Mm.
how does that work exactly? The eternal principles are not so eternal if you take him at his word that there is this
Mm.
consequent nature,
Mm.
by which, as he says, the what's achieved in time feeds back into heaven.
Mm.
In other words, God is changed by the creative decisions made by finite creatures who, yeah, are riffing on the eternal bass note or the melody that God laid down at the beginning, but taking it far enough that God's like, oh, I'm gonna actually change the original melody in light of the creativity that's been achieved by further iterations on this original theme. And so
Mm.
he's you think you've caught him in a reification, and then he's actually got this other side to his philosophy. But
Yeah.
really,
I was only teasing. Like, I know that his scheme is incredibly complex, and he pretty much accounted for most anything I have ever thought of.
yeah, I haven't been able to catch him on something he didn't already think of, but
Yeah, yeah,
I'm working on it. Um, well, hey, I think we should call it quits for now, and surely our conversations will continue. This was a lot of fun. Hopefully,
yeah.
others enjoyed it, and encourage folks to chime in, whether under this video or on Twitter. Yeah, a lot of fun to chat, Tim.
Absolutely my pleasure, Matt. Yeah, thanks for having me again.
So I